Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Miko Peled starts his book with a very interesting picture that while you're reading it, you have that picture in front of you. He talks about his childhood sitting in his grandmother's lap, Sima. Sima holds him and tells him how proud she is of his grandfather, Avraham. And if you notice the similarity, his names, Avraham is similar to my father's name, Abraham or Ibrahim in Arabic. So while I was reading the first part of the book, I stopped at this paragraph, and I'm gonna read it just directly from the book on page 22nd. He goes, in 1923, he, referring to his grandfather Abraham, convinced her, that's Sima, to immigrate with him to Palestine, to participate in, I underscore here, building a Jewish state. Abraham rose in the ranks of the Zionist movement and became a member of the executive board of the Zionist National Council, unquote. So I stopped here at this particular paragraph, and the flashback goes into my own history. Back when I was a kid, when my grandmother was telling me the story about the same period. We're now talking about the period pre-1948. That's what's known to Palestinians as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe, and what's known to Jewish people or Israelis as the Day of Independence. That memory takes me the same situation, however, the words are completely different. Instead of how proud she was, she talks about the Nakba, she talks about displacement, she talks about leaving her own house from the village, walking across other villages with 4 kids, 5 kids, my father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. Now, here is what she says. She goes, we had to leave our house, leave our village, because we heard that Palestinians are being killed in neighboring villages. So that was the atmosphere of fear. Your father, that she continues, your father Ibrahim was 4 years old then. Your uncle Isa was a newborn. We received the news that Palestinians are being killed in neighboring villages, and we have to leave promptly. We gathered what we could. We carried our belongings and started walking directionless. We don't know where we're heading. After we walked for a few minutes, I stop, I look at them, Ibrahim, Musa, Isa was a newborn. Oh, where is he? She couldn't find him. Under the stress, they realized that they forgot him actually at home. So my older uncle runs back, gets him, and they continue back their journey into the West Bank. Now what she refers to here when she says the comment, Palestinians are being killed in neighboring villages, are villages like Deir Yassin, that some of us might have heard about it, but the main documented piece about it was written by Albert Einstein, who in 1948, April 10th, 1948, he wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times where he said, terrorist bands attacked this peaceful village, killed most of its inhabitants, 240 men, women, and children, and kept a few of them alive to parade as captives through the streets of Jerusalem. So these were the news. That's the mode during these days. It's fear, it's only fear, and that's still leading up to the 1948. That's before the declaration. What Albert Einstein refers to here are the groups, the Argonne, the Stern organizations, who are classified as terrorist groups, and the Haganas. Now the family settles in a refugee camp near Nablus, keeping the key to the house, hoping that eventually they will go back And that key of the house has been a symbol for most Palestinians, where every grandmother of anyone of my age has been holding that, hoping that she will eventually go back. Now the time passes. Miko Peled is born in 1961. His father, Matti Peled, rises to become a general in the Israeli army. His father fights in what's known to us as the Six-Day War in 1967, where the outcome of that war was that Israel will occupy the rest of Palestine, West Bank and Gaza, the Golan Heights. This was critical for all Palestinians, because if it signified anything, it signified killing the last hope that they will go back to their homeland. Now there are new facts on the grounds. Everyone is realizing these facts. Miko talks in details about this particular time in his book. So I'll leave you intrigued to read his book. But I will let one more piece out here. He has a picture of his father's passport, and it has some Arabic text in it. And what I thought was interesting, it said in Arabic words, this passport was issued in Palestine. So definitely his passport acknowledged that it was issued in Palestine. Others from our family who were born in Palestine never carried a passport that was issued in Palestine, especially after they moved to Jordan or wherever. It's always either occupied territories or some other name. Now, after 1967, new facts on the grounds, every new settlement, now we start using the word settlement for occupiers moving in and taking certain pieces of land. I grew up hearing about those settlements and how brutal some people living in these settlements were to Palestinians. Things like taking down all the olive trees, vandalizing their houses. So I was hearing that, but it was just narrated to me. I've never really lived it. But the main one was a street in Hebron, which is the main city near my parents' village, where a street called the Death Street, or Shara al-Maut in Arabic. That street is near a settlement called Qaryat Arba'a. They will throw garbage at the Palestinians, they will vandalize the houses, and et cetera, et cetera. But this brutality manifested itself to its utmost level in 1994. And coincidentally, it was February 1994, which is 19 years from now, from today. We woke up on the news that 29 Palestinians at the mosque, it's called Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi, which is the main mosque in Hebron city, were praying, and Muslims go to their morning prayer if there is a mosque nearby in Hebron. A person comes out to them, fully armed, kills 29 people in cold blood. Now, he was assisted by the Israeli army at that time. This person, Baruch Goldstein, turned to be the leader of his area, and he has even some followers. However, why did this strike home? Now, I'm about 20 years old at that time. The families, I hear the names of the people who were dead. They are all well-known families from the Hebron city. And when you hear Nuruddin al-Muhtasib, you hear Ayman Kawasmi, which is the same family name as myself. These are people, now you start recognizing the names. There is a neighbor next to you, your own family. Now, it's not too far, it's not distant. It's not distant, like this is not far away from us. It's people we know, we hear about. I remember one word that my mother told me at that time. She said, quote, "They will call him insane tomorrow." And certainly that was the outcome. Our hands were tied, nothing anyone can do, waiting for the Israeli justice to come. And the outcome of this investigation is, oh, he's insane, he has psychological problems. Now that takes me back to my speaker. Remember, this incident was 1994. Takes us back to Miko Peled. in 1997. He's living in Southern California. He watches the news from Jerusalem. And guess what? Suicide bombing struck the city. He received a call that his niece, Smadar, was missing. And yes, indeed, she was killed. Mr. Peled goes in his book, I'm going to quote here from the book directly. In Israel, war and casualties of war were part of life. As a child, I had been to countless funerals of young people who were killed in wars and, quote, military operations, unquote. Still, the conflict has not become personal until my niece was murdered. Suddenly, I needed to understand what brought those two young Palestinians to blow themselves up. Her death pushed me into bold examination of my Zionist beliefs, my country's history, and the political situation. Unquote. So that takes us to today's meeting. The challenge that sits ahead in front of all of us is how can we foster, after all what happened, a relationship that is built on mutual respect, on equality and mutual respect. And I here would like to underscore the word respect and equality. As Tariq Ramadan, an Oxford scholar, said, it's about respect, not just intolerance, where we hear a lot, because intolerance still keeps you at bay. So I tolerate you, but there is still a distance between us. While with respect, we start from common ground. So with that, I would like to invite our speaker tonight to speak to you. Please join me in welcoming Miko Peled.
Well, thank you for all the introductions, and thank you all for being here tonight. I think this full house speaks to the fact that this is a very important issue, and it's an issue that touches so many people, whether we live in the Middle East or whether we live in the United States or whether we live here in Vancouver, British Columbia. I wanted to ask you, before I get started, just a couple of questions. If you'd raise your hand if you have family in either Israel-Palestine. Anybody here have family there? Okay, thank you. Was anybody born there? Is anybody here that was actually born there, lived there? Okay, thank you. How about anybody visit there? Not necessarily for family? Okay, so you have a pretty knowledgeable crowd. That's good. I gave a talk last year. I gave a talk in front of an 8th grade class. And in preparation for my talk, these 8th graders, who are 13 years old, prepared themselves, they studied the issue, and they took a poll to find out who among them had hope, who among them believed that peace was possible in their lifetime. And the results of their poll were pretty depressing. They found that 80% of them, and they're 13 years old, did not believe peace was possible in their lifetime. So, and they told me this before I began my remarks. And so I told them that I'm a lot older than they are. I'm 51. And there's no question in my mind that there will be peace in my lifetime. And if there was any doubt in my mind, I wouldn't be doing this. And I wanted to ask you tonight, if you would raise your hand if you believe that there will be peace in your lifetime. In Israel-Palestine. That's our issue today. Okay, who does not believe there will be peace in their lifetime? Okay. Anybody just not sure? I did this in another talk, and somebody said, an older lady raised her hand and said, well, I'm 78 years old, so I mean. But I think the importance of the hope is not that we know that it's going to happen tomorrow. The importance of the hope is believing and understanding, not just believing, but understanding that it's possible, and then doing everything we can in order to make it happen. If we're hopeless, then we sit home and we just let things, go as they are. Without hope, what's the drive to move forward and actually do something? And this issue is complicated. There's no question about that. And it's only complicated because it's covered in so many layers of myth and so much double standard. And it's interesting because it's particularly in North America, people believe they're really doing the right thing, even though they are clearly supporting the wrong side. Whether it's in the US, here in Canada, in Britain, in Germany, in other countries in the West, people firmly believe they're helping Jewish people by supporting Israel. Where in fact, all evidence points to the opposite. And one of the biggest myths, well, this is one of the biggest myths, but one of the biggest double standards has to do with what it is that the so-called Jewish state is all about. Because Israel was created as a so-called Jewish state by a movement called Zionism. And the early Zionists, my grandparents were part of them, their point of view was that Jewish people, being that they are the descendants of an ancient tribe that lived in that part of the world some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, have the right, and listen to this, have the right to return to their homeland. So it wasn't me, my parents, my grandparents, or my great-great-parents that lived there and now we are returning. We're talking about a connection or a claim to have a connection or relation to an ancient tribe that resided in that part of the world some several thousand years ago, which gives all Jewish people in the world the right, and they use the word to return. And you have to wonder, how are they able to sell this? How are they able to sell such an absurd notion that because the Jewish people may be the descendants, it's not clear that they are, but maybe the descendants of this ancient tribe, they have the right to conquer an Arab country, engage in ethnic cleansing, and then build a state for themselves on that land. Now that's bad enough, but now let's take a look, let's put this right next to another discussion about the right of return. The right of return of Palestinians. And I'm sure you've seen this, and I'm sure you've heard this, when Israelis and Palestinians, when the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian peace or Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are brought up, the right of return is one issue where Israelis and people who support Israel say, absolutely not. The right of return, there's a red line, we cannot cross it, there's no room to talk about the right of return. It was a long time ago. The Palestinians have to, are you ready for this? They have to forget, because this was a long time ago. So even though many of the Palestinians who were forced out of their home 65 years ago are still alive, some of them in this room today, and even though those that passed away certainly have descendants that are still alive, they still have the deeds to their homes, the keys to their homes, and if they don't, they can show you, they can walk with you to a field full of rubble, and they will find their home, and they will find the mosque, and they will find the well. But those people have to forget, because this was a long time ago. And this is coming from a nation, Israelis, Jewish people, right, who sit every Passover and talk about what? Commemorate something the pharaohs so-called did to the Jews some 5,000, 6,000 years ago. So this is we are commanded to remember, but the Palestinians 65 years ago have to forget. I mean, this is a double standard of such unbelievable proportions. You wonder how anybody is able to sell this. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because the Zionists in today's Israel have always had a very powerful and very smart and effective lobby that was used to sell this stuff. But I think it's important to put this, to really take a good look at this and understand this amazing double standard that exists here. And to sift through the myth and to understand that supporting Israel and supporting Jews have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The Zionists proclaimed themselves to represent the Jews. Nobody voted for them. Nobody voted for my grandfather and his group of that whole generation. They decided that they were going to do this. They were well-dressed, They were well educated, they were white, and so they were able to convince the British and then the Americans and so forth that they had a right to settle that land, which was settled by brown people, basically. And so we as white people have a right to kick them out, because this is how we do things. This makes perfect sense. And that is exactly why they succeeded. And and they had nothing to do with Judaism. Most Jews have never supported Israel. Most Jews have never gone to Israel. Even after the Holocaust, most Jews, most survivors opted to go to other places. So this notion that somehow Israel represents Jews and opposing Israel is opposing Jews or anti-Semitic is completely not true. And I think this is very, very important to understand. Now, I should have said this earlier, but my point of view is certainly not a balanced point of view. And I think it's important. Usually I say this a little bit earlier. I somehow forgot. I think if anybody came here expecting to hear a balanced presentation, then they're going to be sorely disappointed. But I think it's important to understand that this is not a balanced situation. There is no balanced presentation on this issue because there is no balance in this issue. It's not like two people or two children who are, or just can't get along. It's like a lunatic with a loaded gun shooting innocent civilians all over the place, and somebody's got to step in and do something. Now, we heard about the Nakba in the introduction this evening, and I have to tell you, I was born and raised as a very proud and very patriotic Israeli. And when I heard for the first time that Palestinians were calling the War of Independence, our independence, a catastrophe, I was insulted. I was personally insulted. How could anybody call such an important historical event a catastrophe? The rebirth of the Jewish people, finally, Israelis, the Jewish people have their own state and have their independence and so on, and somebody sees it as a catastrophe? And over the years, as I met Palestinians and heard more stories and became more knowledgeable on this issue, I understood why it's called a catastrophe and why it was a catastrophe, and understood that it was a catastrophe. But it wasn't until just a few weeks ago that I saw the catastrophe. I visited two places that I had not visited before. One was a refugee camp in Jordan called the Gaza refugee camp. And this is a refugee camp of refugees. In other words, they were refugees in Gaza in 48, and then in 67 they moved and became refugees in Jordan. And the living conditions, the despair, the poverty, the fact that these beautiful children have to live with no running water, no sewage, in houses that you can't even call houses, 10, 12, 15 people in a room. That this can happen to their house or their friend's house any day. After I visited that refugee camp, the Gaza refugee camp, a couple of days later I actually visited Gaza as well. This is from Gaza itself. The children need to walk to school every day seeing this and not knowing if they come home after school, this will be their home. That nearly 2 million people have to live under siege, where their entire life depends on this, tunnels. This is the particular tunnel that I went through to go into Gaza. Because, of course, going through Israel is prohibited, and going through Egypt sometimes is prohibited, sometimes is not. So I ended up going through the tunnel. The boundary of less than 10 kilometers, you have 1,500 tunnels like this, and this is what keeps people in Gaza alive. Nearly 2 million people. These are the places where you see the Nakba. It's inexcusable, it's unjustifiable, it's inexplicable. In the refugee camp itself, in the Gaza refugee camp in Jordan, like I said, the poverty is so extreme that it's hard to put in words. And at the same time, the houses are meticulously clean. People, there's no running water, there's no sewage system. 40,000 people living on 1 square kilometer. And you know that about 52, 53% are children. And this is an hour drive from Tel Aviv. All of this. It's an hour drive from Jerusalem. I could have gone from Jerusalem to Gaza in an hour and 15 minutes. It took me 14 hours because I had to go to Sinai and through Egypt and go under a tunnel. It's absolutely absurd. And this is why it's a Nakba. And it's an ongoing thing. It's not something that happened 65 years ago. There's this illusion that the Nakba is something that happened 65 years ago. It began 65 years ago. It goes on to this day. So I went from this place where it offended me that somebody called the Israeli independence Nakba to seeing it, understanding it, and then finally seeing it. And the second part of the title of my book is A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. My journey is still ongoing. It's not done yet. I'm discovering more and more and more about Palestine and more about what it means, what Palestine means and what being Palestinian means every single day. I think that a good place in history to start talking about this conflict and starting to understand this conflict is the 29th of November, 1947. That was the day the United Nations came up with this absurd map. This is called the Partition Resolution. The United Nations decided that to end the conflict or to solve the conflict, the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine, they would partition the land into 2 parts and create a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this absurd, ridiculous map is what they came up with. And when you look at this thing, you don't have to be a genius to realize that this is absolutely crazy. I mean, how do you go on the ground and delineate the borders? I mean, look at this thing. But beyond that, the United Nations, in their infinite wisdom, decided to give the larger portion of the country, that belonged to somebody else, not to them, to a small group of Jewish immigrants. At that time, there were less than 500,000 Jewish immigrants living in Palestine. There were about 1.5 million Palestinians who were the Palestinians, to whom this land belonged. Yet the United Nations partitioned the land and decided they were going to give the larger portion to the smaller community of Jewish immigrants. And to this day, we hear people say, you see, this is all the Palestinians' fault because they did not accept the partition resolution. Did somebody in their right mind expect that the Palestinians would accept this? Why would they? Who in their right mind would expect such an absurd resolution? That somebody from the outside, the United Nations, would come, cut off the larger portion of your country, and give it to somebody else. And I don't think anybody expected they would accept it, and I don't think anybody accepted this would work. And as we know, this did not last a single day. And what happened the next day is exactly where the 2 narratives begin to go in opposite directions. As an Israeli, what did I learn? Is what do people still learn in the United States and in Europe? That the Palestinians, or what they say the Arabs, because in Zionist language there is no such thing as Palestinian. The Arabs did not accept the partition resolution and began a massive attack to destroy and kill this small Jewish community. But miraculously, even though the Jewish community was smaller and weaker, somehow they prevailed because we, this Zionist community, we the Jews, we are the descendants of King David who fought Goliath, and we are the descendants of the Maccabees, and we have that ability to overcome this sort of thing, and we defeated the bad Arab armies, those big bad Arab armies, and within 12 months the state of Israel was established, and so on and so forth. And it's a wonderful story, especially when you're a kid. Especially when you know that your father was an officer in those Zionist forces, in those Jewish forces that fought so bravely. But then we take a look at the details and we say, is it really possible that a small Jewish community attacked by massive Arab armies would not only prevail, but manage to conquer 80% of the country, displace 1 million people, and destroy hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities and villages within 12 months. Is it possible? This is not some biblical story. This is something that happened. We can't go back and say, well, the prophets and God and all this. And then we take a look at the details and we realize that these two communities, the Zionist community that was living at the time and the Palestinian communities, they were both expecting and hoping to become states. So they had institutions of state and so on. But there was one thing that the Zionist community had that invested in heavily, and the Palestinians did not. A fighting force. The Zionist militia, by that time, numbered close to 40,000 well-armed men, and very well trained and very well indoctrinated. My father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So in 1947, at the end of 1947, beginning of 1948, who are these Arabs that attacked? What did they attack with? They had no militia, they had no weapons. It's true that the Arab armies, other Arab armies intervened, but that wasn't until 6-7 months later. Well, there were no Arabs that attacked. As soon as this resolution was accepted, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in an effort to conquer as much of the land as possible and get rid of as many people as possible. That was the name of the game, and that is what they managed to accomplish. And when the Arab armies, other Arab armies, did intervene, they were no match for the Zionist forces. Not in numbers, not in training, not in the quality of the weapons, not in anything. Certainly not in motivation. And within 12 months, 80% of the country was conquered, 1 million people, or close to 1 million people, were displaced, and hundreds of towns and villages were wiped off the face of the earth. Some of these towns, by the way, and villages had a long history of over 1,000 years. And on their ruins, the state of Israel was created. Towns and villages and cities and highways were built for Israelis only. Now, what's interesting, what I did in the book, I kind of go back and forth between the story of my family and the story of the conflict, the story of the land. And this is a picture of my mother when she was young. She's 86 years old now. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives there. Like I said, she's 86 years old. And in 1948, she was 22. She was already a young mother. And she was living in a small apartment with her mother in Jerusalem. Now, because she was born and raised in Jerusalem, she knew Jerusalem very well, and she knew the neighborhoods, including the Palestinian neighborhoods, and the Palestinian families, and so on. In 1948, when the Zionist forces took these neighborhoods, and I'm not talking about the old city of Jerusalem. There were neighborhoods outside the old city of Jerusalem, flourishing neighborhoods, with beautiful homes, beautiful, well-to-do families that lived there. Those neighborhoods are still there, the homes are still there, just the people are not. And they were forced to leave, and their homes were made available to Israeli families. And of course, my mother was the wife of an officer who was in the front fighting for the cause. She was offered one of these homes in one of these neighborhoods. And when she told me this story years and years ago, and she told it to me many, many times, and I talk about it in the book, and I speak to her about it a lot. And whenever she talks about it, it raises the same emotions. She says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How can I possibly move into the home of another mother? And then she continued and said, and to see the trucks full of loot. The Israeli forces filled up trucks with loot because these are well-to-do families. These are beautiful homes. Like I said, they're still there. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you've seen them. They're very distinct. And what's interesting about the story, not only that she made the type of moral decision that you would hope other people would have made at 22, but more than that, there was something about the story that bothered me for years and years and years. And it wasn't until actually quite recently when I was working on the book that I could understand why it was bothering me and what the problem was. To begin with, her story was contradicting the national narrative. Because if the national narrative is that they attacked, we won, and they left, that's what Israelis learn. Well, then why can't we take their homes? It's perfectly legitimate. She was presenting a moral question. And on top of that, she was presenting something that we, the Israelis, did wrong without explaining or excusing it. See, in the Israeli discourse, in Zionist discourse, every time the Israelis do something horrific to the Palestinians, whether it's Dir Yassin, whether it's attacking Gaza, regardless, there's always a justification. The way Israelis learn about Dir Yassin is, yes, it was a horrible thing, but thank goodness, because that caused hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee, which enabled us to become the majority. So with the admittance that this was a massacre and was a horrible thing, comes the excuse, but thank goodness because. This is how this is always told. Even today, Israel bombs Gaza knowing that they're killing civilians, but there's always a justification. My mother was telling the story and there was no justification. It was the first time I ever heard anybody talk about this, where the Palestinians were on equal footing as any other human being. This was wrong, period. This is unacceptable, immoral, period. And that was a very interesting experience. And again, like I said, I only came to terms with how meaningful it was quite recently. By the end of 1948, this is what the map looked like. Palestine, most of Palestine became Israel, except for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank was part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was part of Egypt. And then in 1967, in the spring and early summer of 1967, the drums of war began beating when the Egyptian president decided or talked about attacking Israel. He brought his forces into the Sinai Peninsula, which was supposed to be demilitarized. He threatened to close the Straits of Tiran. These are the straits leading up to the port city of Eilat. And the Israeli generals decided this was an opportunity for war. This was a cause for war. When the State of Israel was created, many of the young officers who were serving at the time remained. My father was one of them, and by 1967, these were the generals. So these generals of 1967 were the young commanders of 1948, and they were eager for war, and they were eager to take the West Bank. They felt it was a big mistake that the West Bank wasn't taken in 1948, where it could have been taken. So for them, this was a burning issue, and they saw an opportunity. Now, once again, the story we hear about the 1967 war is that, again, the Israelis were attacked, viciously attacked, unprovoked, by 3 Arab armies who wanted to destroy the State of Israel. And once again, miraculously, this time not in 12 months, but in 6 days, we not only prevailed, we destroyed them, and we conquered lands and tripled the size of the State of Israel. This is a picture of my father. The name of the book, the title of the book is, or the first part of the title is The General's Son. Now, like I said, my father was a general at the time, and he always said that this was not true. From the very beginning, he said this was a war of choice. This was a war, this was a preemptive, the reason we took a preemptive strike is because we felt we could. Now, the talk at the time was about a war against Egypt, to attack Egypt, to punish the Egyptian president for entering his forces into the Sinai and so forth. There was some debate between the generals and the Israeli cabinet as to whether or not to begin the war. It went on for several days. It was a heated debate. One of the strongest, most forceful voices for the war was my father. And of course, the generals won the day like they always did in Israel. And the war against Egypt lasted several days. The Egyptian army was destroyed. The Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip were taken. Then the generals on their own decided to take the West Bank and the Golan Heights because these were 2 areas that they wanted, number one. And number 2, the generals who were in charge of those regions wanted part of the glory. And within 6 days, the State of Israel, the land, the area of the State of Israel was tripled in size. Now, when people try to justify what Israel did, they say, well, Israel was under threat. Israel was under an existential threat. In other words, they had no choice but to attack. As I was working on the book, I went in to look at the Israeli Army archives to learn about my father's military career. And one of the things that I looked at were the minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to that war. They're available. Many historians have looked at them. Many people have written about them. So I wasn't really expecting to see anything new. But there was one thing that I saw that was striking that I had not seen anywhere else. And that is where the generals say clearly, The fact that the Egyptians have brought their forces closer to us present an opportunity, because the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. Not prepared for war. Not a single word about a threat, certainly not an existential threat, but an opportunity, because the Egyptian army, which was really the only army of consequence, the Jordanian and Syrian army were in shambles anyway. They were no match for the IDF. We're not prepared for war, and therefore we have an opportunity to go in and attack. So they went into this war knowing full well that they were going to win. The story about the threat came later on to excuse it, to justify it. And then again, now you understand how in 6 days this happened. There were no Arab armies that attacked. The Arab armies that were there were in shambles, were no match for the Israeli army, which was well armed and well prepared and very motivated. And then within 6 days, the Sinai was taken, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. 3 Arab armies were destroyed. 15,000 Arab soldiers were killed in 6 days. 15,000 Arab soldiers were killed. 700 Israeli soldiers were killed. The ratio says it all. Now, every soldier that dies is somebody's son. It breaks your heart. But the ratio is stunning. This was a war of choice. This was a war of conquest. And indeed, at the end of that war, this is what happened. Palestine was completely erased off the map, and Israel took its place completely. Now, what Israel did in the West Bank after the 1967 war is exactly what Israel did in the rest of Palestine after 1948. Ethnic cleansing, destructions of towns and villages and cities, and massive building for Israelis only on Palestinian land. In other words, this was not something different. This was a finishing the job. And this is exactly how Israeli commanders talk about it, and politicians. Taking the West Bank was finishing the job of 1948. It was finishing the conquest of the land of Israel for the Jews. And so today when people talk about the possibility of a two-state solution where Israel would allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank, it's absurd. It just demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of what Israel is about, a complete misunderstanding of what the goals of Zionism are about. It is impossible to expect that any Israeli government would ever give up the West Bank or any part of the land of Israel. And the proof is in what they did. The West Bank was treated exactly like the rest of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing, destruction, and building for Israelis only. Now, on top of that, there was one more aspect. Palestine was an Arab country for 1,500 years. Suddenly you come in and you implant European Jews. Not all of them European, some Arab Jews were brought as well. But basically, they were trying to create a new history. They had to de-Arabize, change the names, change the history, destroy monuments. And this is something that's taking place to this very day. As you drive up and down Israel, you see all these names of cities and towns and villages and kibbutzim and so on. If you take a look at the name, you will find that it's a bastardization, if you will, of an older Arab name, of a town or a village that was there before. Same thing, very similarly, you see very similar things in the West Bank as well. If you've been to Jerusalem, to the old city of Jerusalem, if you stepped out where the Wailing Wall is, stepped out the gates, and walked down the hill, there's a community called Silwan. It's a community of 50,000 people who lives in this valley, just down from the old city. Now, if you stand between the old city and Silwan, what you see is the Jewish quarter, which was rebuilt and it was very grand. And somebody decided that under the homes of the people in Silwan rests the true city of King David. Now, there's no historical proof that there was a King David, but never mind that. That community is being destroyed. And a new park, an archaeological park, is being built called the City of David. It's endorsed by all these government officials. It's endorsed by all these international foundations. You can already see tour buses coming to see the City of David as the homes of people, 50,000 people, are being destroyed. First of all, to create the park. Then in the periphery, because they dig so much, the foundations of other homes are being destroyed. And then settlers, Israeli settlers, taking over more and more homes. There are already 500 or 600 settlers in the periphery. An entire community is being destroyed in broad daylight today in order to create this absurd connection between today's Israel and King David. And this is the process that's taking place in many other places. It's a de-Arabizing and creating this new mythical history, or taking this mythology and trying to make it into history. My father did something very interesting after he retired from the military, or actually even before he retired. Right as the war of 1967 ended, he said, now we have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians. Because we conquered the entire country, but we still have another nation here, we need to live in peace with them. The only way we can live in peace with them is if we allow them their rights as a nation. And that is when, this was kind of the late 60s, early 70s, when this idea of a two-state solution came about, of a Palestinian state in the West Bank. He retired. For several years he talked about it. Eventually, he and several other Israelis created a movement that promoted this idea, and they were contacted by officials of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat's top people. In this picture, my father is in a meeting with Issam Sartawi, who was the Palestinian ambassador to Paris for many, many years. He was assassinated later on. But these meetings began in kind of the late or mid-70s, and they were all secret. They would meet in North Africa, they would meet in Europe, and all these hideaways. But the Israeli government was aware of them. Every time they'd come back, my father would go and report to the prime minister. But Israel would have nothing to do with it. Now, on the Palestinian side, these were official Palestinian representatives, in other words, representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat's top people. On the Israeli side, there were people like my father, people who had a name and a reputation, but were really renegades. They represented no one. They had no, official capacity. Later on in the 80s, the Knesset passed a law that made these meetings illegal. It didn't stop them, because they still kept meeting, but they made them illegal. And it wasn't until 1993 that finally Israel was willing to speak to the PLO and negotiate. And as some of you, I'm sure, recall, September of 1993 on the White House lawn, the Oslo Accords were signed by Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And people thought Rabin had changed. Israel has changed. Finally, this beautiful, wonderful side, this liberal side of Israel is coming into being. But when we look once again at the facts, when we look once again at the details, we can see that by 1993, Israel had made certain that it was impossible to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank. The West Bank was completely integrated into Israel. And that is when they decided to negotiate with the PLO. Not for a peace agreement, for a surrender. My father died in 1995 of cancer, and just before he died, there was an interview with him in one of the major Israeli papers. And the title, the headline for the interview was, Matti Peled says, Rabin does not want peace. To say in 1995 that Rabin does not want peace, it was insane. He was Mr. Peace, Nobel Peace Prizes everywhere. I mean, he was the man of peace. How could anybody say that? There were others. Edward Said also said this, that the Oslo Accords were no good, and this was not going to lead to peace. They read the accords. They read the agreement. And that's why they knew it was not going to lead to peace. It was an attempt to bring the Palestinians to surrender, promising them nothing, offering them nothing. And that's exactly what it was, and that's exactly why it fell apart. In the year 2000, President Clinton tried to close the deal. He brought in the new Israeli Prime Minister, Barak, who everybody expected would be a man of peace, and Yasser Arafat. They all went to Camp David, and everybody expected they would come up with a peace agreement. They negotiated for days and days and days, and then they came out with nothing. And Bill Clinton, if some of you may recall, came out and blamed Arafat. He said the Palestinian gave some, but the Israelis gave more. So the problem that the way Bill Clinton described it, and the way this is being described to this day, the problem is the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. By agreeing to the two-state solution, they gave up 80% of their country and the rights to return. and the recognition and making peace with the people who destroyed their country and made them refugees. And they are not willing to make concessions? What Arafat was not willing to do was complete surrender. He was not willing to take anything less than the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. And these are things that no Israeli government will ever give the Palestinians. The most liberal, peace-minded Israeli government had always maintained 3 no's. No to the Jordan River Valley. No to the expanded boundaries of East Jerusalem. And no to the major settlement blocks. When you combine these 3, that's almost the entire West Bank. These 3 no's mean no to a Palestinian state. And that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly why there is no peace and there is no Palestinian state. There was never an intention on the Israeli side to allow a Palestinian state to be established. And like I said, as we see today, the West Bank is completely integrated with the rest of Israel. Now, these things come at a price, like you heard earlier, once again in the introduction. And in September of 1997, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack. She was 13 years old. This is her, Smadar. Now, I was living in the United States already at this time, and when something like this happens, you just don't know what to think, you don't know what to feel, you don't know what to say. It's a kind of a shock that just takes you, you can't, you become speechless. I took the first plane back to Jerusalem, and my sister's apartment was, of course, filled with reporters because this was the granddaughter of a famous general. But not only was a famous general, he was also Mr. Peace with Palestine. And now look what the Palestinians did to him, so to speak. That was kind of the sense. And when my sister, finally after the funeral came out to see everybody, she was, of course, asked about retaliation, about who's responsible, and revenge, and so on. And the first things that came out of her mouth was, look, don't talk to me about retaliation. No real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. Now you want to know who's responsible, she said. I'll tell you who's responsible. She said, these 2 young men were brought to such a level of despair and hopelessness that they were willing to take their own lives and the lives of other innocent civilians, including my daughter. How did they come to this level of hopelessness? She said, it's the brutal oppression and the brutal occupation that we, the Israelis, have placed upon Palestinians that have brought them to do this. Because when you take away people's land, and you destroy their homes, and you place their fathers and older brothers in jail, and you shoot their younger brothers and sisters in their schoolyard, and you deprive them of water, of hope. This is what happens. And she said, I hold the Israeli government directly responsible for the death of my daughter. So now you had an Israeli mother who had just lost her daughter turning everything upside down. Because what do we know to be true? We know that the Palestinians are terrorists, the Israelis are the victims. We know that Israelis want peace, Palestinians won't make concessions. Suddenly this bereaved mother is turning everything upside down. Now she and her husband became activists, speaking all over the world about the need to end the violence. And I came back to the US, and you can't just go back to work the next day like nothing happened. But on the other hand, you can't just not go back to work because life goes on. So finding some kind of a balance between these 2 realities was very difficult. But eventually I was able to find a dialogue group, a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group in San Diego. This was a couple of years after this. It took me some time to figure this out. But it was the very first time I ever met Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, a mixed city. But the problem is it's a very segregated, it's a very racist city. So as an Israeli, you never meet Palestinians. First time I ever met Palestinians, I was 39 years old. I was living in San Diego. Not only, though, it was the first time I met Palestinians, but it was the first time I was with Palestinians and we were equal. In other words, They didn't need a permit to be there. There were no checkpoints they had to cross to get there or to go home. There was no curfew they had to meet. We could meet when we wanted to meet, talk about what we wanted to talk. We all went back home, and that was it. We were completely equal. And I tell you, there were Israelis that would come to these meetings, and it would drive them crazy, and they would not return. And other Jewish, American Jews as well. And they would say to me, how do you sit with these extremists? How do you sit with these people? And I thought, what extremists? These people are here for the same reason I'm here. We're trying to figure this out. And that led me, like I said earlier, to learn about the Nakba, to learn about the destruction, to learn about all these things that I knew that we as Israelis had never done. It's not that I didn't know we did them. I knew we couldn't have done them because we're Israelis, we're good. We don't engage in massacres. We don't kick people out of their homes. Perhaps there was an incident here or there. And my good fortune was that this Palestinian community, these people that I met, were gracious and generous enough that they took me by the hand like a baby and led me through this process, this very agonizing and painful process to realize that what you know to be true is not. It's like somebody telling you that your father is a killer. I mean, it's a horrific, horrific process. Very, very painful. But nobody ever accused me of anything. It was a very generous, very gracious process where I was able to kind of let go and then realize that there was something else that I could hold on to. And so it took me, like I said, it took several years. But it was thanks to that, the generosity of the Palestinian community there, that I was able to do this. And then I began traveling into Palestinian communities within Israel and then to the West Bank. And as I traveled into the West Bank, one interesting thing I saw was this sign. And if you've traveled across the checkpoints between Israel and the West Bank, you've seen these signs. These are massive red warning signs, as you can see. And they say in Hebrew, they tell you that this particular road upon which you are traveling leads to Area A, which is under Palestinian control, and that it is forbidden for Israelis to enter Area A. It's life-threatening, and it's a felony. And 2 exclamation marks, not 1. Now, when you see a sign like this, if you have any sense at all, you turn around, you go home. It's a warning sign. It's telling you you're risking your life. Luckily, I didn't have that kind of sense. I walked through, and I know others that have, and I've been doing it ever since. And every time I walk through, I always see the exact same thing. And by the way, I saw this just a few weeks ago going under the tunnel into Gaza. You see kids going to school, which is the most common sight in Palestinian cities, little kids with their uniforms and backpacks. You see traffic jams, you see stores, you see businesses, you see markets. I've yet to see the threat. I've yet to see the threat. Where's the threat? What is it that's threatening my life when I go into these places? I've yet to see the Palestinian waiting to kill me. And I've been to refugee camps. Like I said, I've been to Gaza. I've seen Hamas people. I've seen all kinds of monsters. Nobody was waiting to kill me. And eventually I realized that the sign and the wall and the massively armed soldiers and the harassment and terrorizing of Palestinians in checkpoints and the terrorizing of Palestinians at Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv Airport, which is a horrific process of terrorizing people for no reason, has nothing to do with anybody's safety. This has nothing to do with security. It's a process where they always want to keep one side afraid and one side angry and frustrated. And that way the two people can never get together. That way you will never solve this issue. And that's exactly the point of all of this. But in the end, we have to come to some kind of a conclusion. And this is how I end the book. In the end, we have to have some kind of resolution. Today, we have about 6 million Palestinians and about 6.5 million Israelis all living in that country. Israel has integrated the West Bank. Israel created one state in all of Palestine, or the land of Israel, if you will. One state, one Jewish state, even though half the population is not Jewish. The price of having, or the only way you can have a Jewish state in an Arab country where half the population is not Jewish, is when you have thousands of political prisoners, you have a massive army, that terrorizes the non-Jewish population. You have massive attacks on civilian populations like we see in Gaza periodically. And we see a conflict that never ends. And you cannot have a democracy. There is no way you could have a democracy if you have a Jewish state in a country where half the people are not Jewish. Half the population is not participating in the process. They're not part of the state. And therefore, when people say that Israel is a democracy, it's a joke. Israel is a democracy only if you're an Israeli Jew. So for me, it's a democracy. I come, I go, I say what I like, I say what I please, I do what I please. I can vote. My vote actually counts. Well, mine doesn't, but Israelis' votes count, in general count. And then so that's one part of the population. And now this is why Israel is compared to apartheid, because you have different laws to govern different parts of the population. Then you have the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. The Palestinians of 48, which Israel likes to call the Arabs of Israel. They're not Palestinians, they are the Arabs of Israel. They have no identity beyond that. No connection to the land beyond that. There are about 1.5 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and there are over 30 laws in the law books that discriminate against them specifically. And it's quite funny because people who support Israel always say, see what a wonderful democracy it is? 1.5 million citizens who are not Jewish, and they can vote, and they thrive, and they do well, and they don't even want to leave. Yeah. The Palestinian communities in Israel are so neglected that the situation in some of them is worse than it is in Gaza. It's complete neglect. The Israeli police won't go in when there's crime. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single dollar invested or a single permit ever given in 65 years for anybody to build anything within the Palestinian communities inside Israel. While at the same time, Israel builds for Jews everywhere all the time. And then there's this whole environment of racism and segregation. And then you go into the West Bank and Gaza, where you have people who have no rights at all. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are at the mercy of the Israeli military, which is nothing but a glorified terrorist organization. It's probably the best armed, or one of the best armed, one of the best financed, one of the best fed terrorist organization in the world, the Israeli army. Of course, they have commanders and they have uniforms, so we treat them with respect. We don't call them terrorists. To be a terrorist, you have to have brown skin and have a rock in your hand. That's what qualifies you to be a terrorist. And this is how this is maintained. So where do we go from here? This land will never be partitioned. No state of Israel will ever be part of the solution. The state of Israel is the problem. The notion of a Jewish state is the problem. Just like apartheid in South Africa was the problem. You couldn't have solved the problem in South Africa unless you got rid of apartheid. You cannot solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue unless you get rid of the Jewish state and transform it into a democracy. Zionism and the Jewish state are in the way of peace. They are contradictory terms. They cannot be peace and the Jewish state and the state of Israel. If we believe in peace, if we believe in justice, we have to strive for a democracy to replace this absurd notion of a Jewish state in an Arab country. And there's nothing anti-Semitic about it. Nobody's talking about a Holocaust. Nobody's talking about destruction. We're talking about inclusion, including everybody who lives there in the process of the state, allowing everybody equal rights. There's nothing anti-Semitic about that because there's nothing Jewish about Israel. I mean, they happen to be Jews, but they certainly don't represent Jews. And there's nothing wrong about saying this because this is the only way to move forward. Like I said, the price of a Jewish state is that it's not going to be a democracy. You'll have thousands and thousands of political prisoners. And by the way, the Palestinian prisoners in Israel, thousands of them, over 90% have not been charged with violence. Those that have been charged at all, because many of them have not been charged with anything. But over 90% have not even been charged with violence. These are political prisoners. and the brutal attacks and so on and so forth. This is the price of having a Jewish state. So it's a question of values. Do we believe in democracy and justice, in the right of people to live in their land, and the right of people to return to their homes? Or do we believe in this messianic, absurd notion that there has to be a state for Jewish people? Now the hope, or my hope, comes from the fact that I know it's possible. There are many, many different levels upon which Israelis and Palestinians are already integrated. In the hospitals, you see doctors everywhere, Palestinian doctors, nurses. Almost every aspect of life, you see them mixed. You see this inevitability of the mix of the two societies. You have two societies that are actually very, very similar. So it's inevitable that they will be able to integrate. It's inevitable that this will happen because it's unsustainable. And it's inevitable this will happen because it's morally wrong for this to continue. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's important, it's crucially important to believe that it's possible, to see that it's possible, to have hope, because it's a beautiful country. It's a country that has endless potential. And these are two societies that have endless potential as well. And they can work together, and they can live together, and then they can create a great democracy together. But it has to be within the context of a real democracy with equal rights. Thank you all very much.